Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. The environmental crisis I'm talking about in this series of videos will be something very fundamental. It will not be something temporary or the end of a cycle we will soon exit to go back to our former way of living. No, it will be the inevitable and forced transformation of an industrial civilization that destroys everything into a civilization obsessed with the survival of the natural environments that keep us alive. And between those two very different civilizations, there will be a painful transition of negative growth that will last much longer than me or you, whatever your age. That environmental crisis will be the end result of something that happened millions of years ago when mankind started to evolve much more rapidly than any other living species, and that was genetically as well as culturally. Our cultural evolution played the most important role here, since any genetic evolution normally takes generations before producing any meaningful results. In reality, the two types of evolution reinforce each other, since any new major invention multiplied the number of human beings, which increased their chances to have more positive mutations, especially in the brain, which of course helped them to make more invention and discoveries. The invention of the first tools triggered the whole process by transforming our ancestors into the most dangerous predators of tropical Africa. This is when they started to destroy their natural habitats by killing one by one their animal and human competitors. In the case of the other human species, we know they existed, the fact that our own species was everywhere the only one to survive shows that our ancestors played a significant role in their demise. Such genocides were inevitable between species whose evolution was essentially cultural. Because you see, two different species cannot solve their conflicts by having sex and by creating a United Nation. Races can do that. Species cannot. As a result, the inevitable outcome when two different human species fought for the same resources on the same territory was the extinction of the less technologically advanced. This is the reason why we are the only surviving human species. If the first tools revolution took millions of years, it's because it required many modifications of the human body, or if you want, many modifications of our genes, which always takes a lot of time. For instance, to leave the trees where our monkey-like ancestors were hiding forced them to stand upright and to start walking on their posterior hands, which became feet. To run after the animals they injured with their spears, our ancestors had to become long-distance runners who sweated a lot in the hot African climate, which caused the almost total disappearance of our body hair. To better organize their societies and their hunt, they also had to develop even more the language centers of their brains, etc. It is only when our ancestors had become modern humans like us that they could experience a series of purely cultural revolutions like the fire revolution or the agricultural revolution. Those purely cultural revolutions increased tremendously their number and their power. This is when they started to reorganize the whole planet to suit their own needs. The fact that cultural progress is way faster than genetic progress explains why the pace of change kept increasing on the planet during the last hundreds of thousands of years. This is what caused the acceleration of history I often talk about. It is worth mentioning that the species which even today cannot cope with the ever faster pace of change are precisely those who reproduce and adapt very slowly, the whales and the elephants, for example, while many other species who reproduce and adapt very quickly fare much better. Just think about the rats, the cockroaches, and the weeds. Considering all the damage done by mankind, must we conclude that our species is a pest that should be eliminated from the surface of the world? Absolutely not. In fact, our species, with its big brain, its intelligence, and its creativity, is a blessing for our life form. It is a true progress that was accomplished through 4 billion years of evolution. The destructions we are responsible of are simply the mistakes of a young species that do not understand yet what it is doing. When we will have learned to use our faculties more efficiently, we will help our life form to spread among the stars. During the next billions of years, a time frame humans cannot understand, our descendants will create all over the galaxy artificial gardens which will allow our life form to adapt to billions of new environments. But that brilliant future is very far away. For the time being, the present generations must find a way to survive to the long periods of negative growth that will soon begin. Because we can no longer ignore the decline of our natural environments. Tropical forests are really burning. Overfishing is really emptying our oceans. Millions of wild species are really declining and many are on the verge of extinction. Our industrial pollution is really poisoning the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat. It is not a dream or a bogeyman story invented by frog lovers. It's really happening, and the problem is growing fast. Nowadays, so much energy is released in the environment. Things are happening so fast that even human beings became unable to cope with the present acceleration of history. All over the world, we have reached physical limits. For instance, the age-old movement of our populations from the center of the continents towards the ocean's shores is almost complete. Billions of people are now living in megacities located near the oceans. This is the end of the road. As we showed in the last video of this series, our industrial technologies have completed their travel around the world and are coming back to poison us all. Everything, everywhere is polluted, even in the middle or at the bottom of the oceans. Our global population, our consumption, our comfort, our pollution, and our public and private debts have all reached record levels. Our scientists, our intellectuals, and our artists have understood that a long time ago, and they tried to warn us with the books, reports, or documentaries to no avail. Well, it's true that these days all humans can see with their own eyes and smell with their own nose that everything is polluted. Everybody understood that sooner or later we will have to pay our environmental debts. We may be able to postpone or to slow down the crisis I'm talking about, but we will not avoid it. The reason is very simple. Our ever-growing industrial world pollutes to collect raw materials, pollutes to transform them in finished products, pollutes again to consume them, and pollutes again to get rid of them. This is a totally linear process of destruction that kills our natural environments one after the other. We can summarize the problem with a very simple equation. The environmental impact of our species is equal to the global effects of our technologies multiply by the effects of our consumption, multiply by the effects of our production, and multiply again by the effect of our populations. And all those elements are growing very fast. At first glance, the simplest way to create a viable equilibrium between our industrial societies and our natural environments would be to reduce the negative effects of our technologies. After all, it's our technological revolutions that made possible the growth of our consumption, of our production, and of our populations. Unfortunately, very few of our technologies are environmentally friendly, and those that are have been developed not to protect the environment, but to make profits. For instance, our hydroelectric plants or our modern information technologies that allow us to move at the speed of light an infinite quantity of information without creating much pollution. To improve our present technologies and to make them environmentally friendly will probably take centuries. And don't forget what we said in the last video. In the future, it will be increasingly difficult to find enough capital to finance our laboratories. Since we lack time and money, the best way to solve our environmental problem could be to reduce our global consumption. That would be extremely efficient, since any market economy is guided by demand. Demand is what decides what will be produced in our factories. Fortunately, there is a very easy way to reduce the demand of any product. You only have to increase its price by adding all the environmental costs related to its production. The only problem with such a simple solution is that it will be extremely unpopular, especially among the poor of our former third world, who think it is now their turn to enjoy the American way of life. In fact, any official attempt by anybody anywhere to reduce significantly the standard of living of the world population will provoke popular revolts that will soon degenerate in a worldwide chaos. In 2008, we had a foretaste of what is coming with the Greek riots that followed the imposition by the Greek governments of very severe austerity measures. The anarchy this will create all over the world will no longer be governed by the laws of politics or sociology, but by the toughest laws of biology that will simply retake the control of our history. It was like that millions of years ago, before our monkey-like ancestors climbed down their trees somewhere in tropical Africa. The most important of those biological laws will be the law of natural selection that systematically favors the survival and the well-being of the best adapted individuals. In the case of a worldwide negative growth crisis, the best adapted individuals to the situation will be, among others, the predators who will know all the dirty little tricks to steal other people's belongings. It is precisely what our industrial entrepreneurs did during the last decades when they moved their dirtiest factories in countries where the natural environments were still in pretty good shape. It is also what our superior classes did during the subprime crisis of 2008 when they convinced their political friends to rescue their bankrupt banks and multinationals by creating gigantic national debts you will have to pay. Since then, our governments kept working for the financial community by passing laws that will allow bankers to steal the money from your bank accounts during the next financial crisis. Everything has also been put in place to allow the private bankers that who control our central banks to flood the market with the trillions of dollars they will create out of thin air if the economic situation was to become real bad. The hyperinflation, all that money printing will create, will have two main effects. First, it will eliminate our mountains of public and private debts, and second, it will force you to repay them indirectly by drastically reducing the value of your salaries, of your pensions, and of everything you own. It is worth mentioning here that to avoid being massacred by rioters, the superior classes of a society in crisis always try to alleviate the suffering of the poor who live near them by organizing soup kitchen and other similar relief systems. They do that especially when a revolution is brewing by stealing the food reserves of the farmers who cannot regroup and defend themselves because they are scattered on a very large area. It is important to realize that our superior classes never gave us anything unless they were forced to. If, during the last century, the middle classes of the Western world enjoyed a very good standard of living, it was because they lived in cities and because their expertise and knowledge were essential in an industrial economy. If we find free hospitals for the poor, even in the most brutal dictatorship, it is not because old, sick, and handicapped people are dangerous, they cannot fight. It is because everywhere rich people are afraid of epidemics. One of the consequences of the proximity law I'm talking about is that during the coming crisis, the situation will be relatively good in the cities inhabited by rich and powerful people, a little worse in the surrounding countryside, much worse in the most inaccessible regions, for instance where the Inuit live, and real bad in poor foreign countries. Isolated continents like the three Americas should fare better than those located near the most dangerous powder kegs of the modern world, and much better than landlocked countries like Bolivia, Niger, or Mongolia, which always remained poor because they had no easy access to the world oceans. I remind you that the development aid, the food sent when there is a famine, and the humanitarian researches made to control and eliminate tropical disease like Ebola, malaria, or the dengue all come from the rich countries. It's not hard to imagine the disasters created on an already destitute continent like Africa when the crisis will force us to stop helping it. In the future, the impoverishment of all mankind will force everybody to become more efficient, self-centered, and thrifty. As a result, the most pressing problems of the present world will tend to be solved near their sources, where they will be the most unpleasant. I'm thinking here about the overpopulation of places like Ethiopia or Bangladesh, about the massive industrial pollution in overpopulated countries like India or China, or about the land poisoning in the three Americas by thousands of different toxic fertilizers and pesticides. And we didn't talk about the explosive situation found in that true center of the world we called the Middle East. In the rich countries where wasting almost became a way of life, a lot of things will disappear. Our overconsumption, our mass tourism, as well as surrealistic places like Disneyland and Las Vegas. Fashion will soon go out of fashion because very few people will be rich and stupid enough to replace goods in perfect condition by brand new ones only to impress the neighbor. Meat and sugar consumption will also decrease along with our propensity to overeat. Gardening will be popular again, even in cities. Since our governments and our pension funds will be bankrupt, the family will also make a strong comeback to become again the main safety net of all mankind. In other words, the Western decadence will disappear with all its upside-down values and its sex and drugs and rock and roll, only to be replaced by a civilization based on hard work and economy. Anyway, workers will then be paid according to their economic value and not according to their rights or anything like that. In North America, this will be a true cultural revolution. For the first time in more than 4 centuries, the North Americans will not be able to become rich by wasting the resources of an immense and almost empty continent. Their unemployment rate will be so high that mass immigration will have to stop. It happened during the Great Depression of the 1930s. This time, however, it could be permanent. Only that would affect profoundly their culture by allowing them to get rid of all the costly consequences of multiculturalism. By creating homogeneous and efficient regions all over the continent, the population will be able to produce the maximum of wealth with as few conflicts, losses, and pollution as possible. I remind you that this is precisely the reason why most nations in history have persecuted their heretics, their dissidents, and their unconventional thinkers. To save money and energy, Washington could try to reinforce those natural tendencies by eliminating all the anomalies created during the conquest of the West, a conquest that followed an east-west direction on a continent where geography has a general north-south orientation. To achieve that, Washington could redraw the political map of the continent by eliminating the artificial linear borders drawn on the map since the 17th century, borders that have nothing to do with the natural world, as you can see on this image. The idea here would be to regroup each natural economic region of North America under a single and efficient government. The political borders of each new state should coincide as much as possible with the natural borders of the region, for example, by following the ridgeline of a mountain range. That rational reorganization of North America would be made permanent by the fact that poverty will have killed the American car culture with all its costly consequences. Since governments will no longer have enough money to repair the extensive road system of the continent, it's already the case, the only part that will not fall into total disrepair will be the most essential and profitable roads. As a result, the population will tend to leave the farthest suburbs as well as the largest cities and move to medium-sized cities where work and food will be available. People will say, if we do all that, the continent will become a patchwork of nations with distinct culture and economies. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. If we want to save our planet from total destruction, we will have to stop fighting against its geography. We will talk about it with much more details in future videos. The drastic reduction of our global consumption will automatically reduce our global production as well as the pollution we produce. That reduction will have to be important since all the most accessible deposits of raw materials on this planet have already been fully exploited. In the 21st century, we must produce a lot of pollution to exploit what is called source rocks. A source rock is a rock formation where minerals or hydrocarbons are disseminated because nature didn't have enough time to concentrate them through natural processes. Petroleum is a very good example of that, since we no longer find new oil deposits near the surface or near the markets. It was like that in the 19th century Pennsylvania. These days, our never-ending industrial growth forces us to look for new oil fields under the polar ice, in deep seas, or in the tar sands. And all that creates an enormous pollution, a fact that the oil producers refuse to admit because they don't want to pay for the damages created by their companies. Similar remarks could be made for any other natural resource, including fresh air and potable water. In the next video, we will talk about the main factor behind the collapse of our natural environments, namely our never-ending population growth. I thank you in advance to recommend this video to your friends and family. See you next time.